Pope Leo XIV's heartbreaking farewell to his dying dog left everyone in tears, but the story began long before the world knew of their bond. In the misty dawn of the Vatican gardens, where history and holiness intertwined among ancient cypress trees, a private ritual unfolded that would soon break hearts around the world. The most powerful man in the Catholic Church walked slowly beside a failing companion who had never cared about his title, only about the rhythm of his footsteps and the warmth of his hand. The gardens were silent, not the reverent silence of prayer, but the heavy stillness that settles before loss arrives. The fountains whispered softer that morning. The birds seemed to hold their songs. Even the breeze moved cautiously through the hedgerows, as if sensing something fragile in its path. Pope Leo XV walked the gravel path as he did every dawn, his white cassock gleaming against the dark foliage. But today, his eyes rarely lifted to the beauty around him. Instead, they remained fixed on Benito, the aging shepherd mix who had been his shadow for 15 years. The dog's steps were labored, his once proud stride reduced to a careful shuffle. Every few meters he would stop, sides heaving with effort. "Take your time, old friend," Leo murmured, his Italian accent thickening with emotion. "We have nowhere important to be." Benito looked up, his clouded eyes finding his master's face with unerring accuracy. His tail, once a perpetual pendulum of joy, offered just 2 gentle sweeps before stillness returned. Leo knelt on the path, papal dignity forgotten as gravel pressed through fine fabric to his knees. His weathered hands that blessed multitudes and signed decrees affecting millions, now gently cradled a graying muzzle. "Is this our last morning walk, Benito?" he whispered, words meant for no one but the universe and the dog who had heard all his private prayers. From the shadow of a cypress, Vatican gardener Marco Varelli watched, pruning shears forgotten in his grip. He had maintained these gardens for 22 years and had witnessed the secret morning walks for the past 3. The Holy Father never acknowledged his presence, and Marco respected the unspoken boundary. But today, seeing Benito's struggle, the gardener's heart twisted. The Pope gestured toward a stone bench beneath an olive tree, their usual rest spot. Benito attempted to jump up as he always had, but his back legs betrayed him. Without hesitation, Leo gathered the dog in his arms, lifting him with surprising strength for a man in his 70s. "I've got you," Leo said, settling onto the bench with Benito across his lap. "I will always carry you when you cannot walk." The sun broke through the morning mist, casting golden light across man and dog as they sat in communion deeper than words. Marco turned away, throat tight, knowing he was witnessing something sacred, the love that makes us human, even when wrapped in the trappings of the divine. The Pope's private study had always been a sanctuary of polished wood and leather-bound wisdom, where centuries of thought gathered in hushed reverence. But today it felt invaded. The veterinarian's metal examination table had been placed near the window, its clinical steel an unwelcome intruder among antique furnishings. Sunlight spilled across the room, illuminating dust motes that danced, oblivious to the gravity settling upon human hearts. Dr. Alessandra Moretti moved with practiced efficiency, her hands gentle but her manner professional as she examined Benito. The dog lay quietly on the table, resignation in his eyes, as if he understood this was no ordinary checkup. Behind her, Sister Maria Constanza, the Pope's private secretary, stood with a clipboard, her expression carefully neutral despite the wetness gathering at the corners of her eyes. Leo XIV stood absolutely still, hands clasped behind his back. To the world, he was Il Papa, the Holy Father, shepherd to billions. But in this moment, he was simply a man watching his oldest friend being examined, feeling as helpless as any pet owner in any clinic around the world. "His kidneys are failing." "Your Holiness," Dr. Moretti said, her voice softening the clinical edges of her diagnosis, "the blood work confirms what I suspected. His body is shutting down." Leo nodded once, the slightest movement. "How long?" he asked, his voice steady despite the earthquake beneath its foundations. Days, perhaps a week. The veterinarian's honesty was both brutal and merciful. He is in pain, though he hides it well. At these words, Benito lifted his head slightly, looking directly at Leo as if to say, "I would never complain to you. Can we make him comfortable?" Leo asked, moving forward to place his hand on Benito's head. Dr. Moretti began explaining medications, schedules, warning signs. Sister Constanza wrote everything down, her pen scratching against paper, the only sound besides the veterinarian's voice. Leo listened, his face composed, yet something shifted behind his eyes with each new detail, each step toward the inevitable. When the examination finished, Leo lifted Benito himself, refusing assistance. The dog settled against his chest, head tucked beneath the Pope's chin. For a moment, just a breath, Leo's composure slipped. His eyes closed, his shoulders curved inward, and he pressed his lips to the top of Benito's head. Sister Constanza and Dr. Moretti looked away, offering privacy within the shared space. The secretary's hand tightened around her pen until her knuckles whitened. Some moments were too sacred for even trusted eyes. "Thank you, Doctor," Leo said finally. His composure returned, though his voice carried new gravel. "Sister, please see that Dr. Moretti has everything she needs." As they prepared to leave, Leo spoke again. "And please," he paused, searching for words that would not diminish the gravity of his request. "This remains within these walls." Both women nodded, understanding flowing between them. This was not papal business. This was a private heartbreak that, for now at least, belonged only to the man, not the office. When the door closed, Leo sat in his chair, still holding Benito, and finally allowed a single tear to trace the weathered landscape of his cheek. That night, as Benito slept on his cushion beside the papal bed, Leo's mind wandered back through the corridors of memory to a different place, a different time, when he had been simply Father Miguel Delgado in the dusty parish of San Cristobal on the outskirts of Buenos Aires. The weight of papal responsibility slipped away as he remembered the young priest he had been, full of idealism, and via serving a community suspicious of change. It had been raining that day, unusual for the season, turning the unpaved streets to mud and sending locals hurrying for shelter. Father Miguel had just finished evening mass to a near-empty church when he heard it, a high, desperate whine coming from behind the garbage bins at the parish boundary. The puppy had been small enough to fit in his cupped hands, ribs visible. Beneath matted fur, one ear torn, eyes barely open but still fighting. Someone had left it to die, wrapped in a dirty rag and tossed away like refuse. "What have we here, little warrior?" Father Miguel had whispered, sheltering the trembling body against the rain with his jacket. The next morning, Senora Vasquez, his housekeeper, had discovered the puppy sleeping in a box near the kitchen stove and crossed herself in displeasure. "Father, this is not appropriate. We have enough strays in San Cristobal without you bringing them into God's house." "And where better for the unwanted to find sanctuary than in God's house?" he had replied, his gentle tone masking the steel. Beneath, word spread quickly. Parish council members arrived, concern etched on their faces. "Father, a dog will drive away parishioners," Senor Martinez warned. "People already say you're too unorthodox." Father Miguel had listened to their concerns with the patience his position demanded, the puppy sleeping against his chest throughout the impromptu meeting. When they finished, he nodded thoughtfully. "I understand your concerns," he said, "but I cannot preach God's mercy on Sunday and ignore suffering on Monday." His fingers gently stroked the puppy's head. "This little one will stay." "You're choosing a dog over your congregation?" Senora Ortiz had asked, incredulous. "I'm choosing compassion," he'd answered simply. "The church will survive a puppy. The puppy might not survive without the church." In the weeks that followed, the puppy, named Benito after the parish's founding father, grew stronger. Father Miguel took him everywhere, visiting the sick, teaching catechism, even sitting quietly during confessions. Those who had been most opposed gradually softened, especially when Benito began greeting Sunday worshippers with gentle enthusiasm. 6 months later, when Father Miguel received news of his transfer to Rome, the parish that had once objected gathered funds to ensure Benito could make the journey with him. Now, 15 years and many promotions later, Leo reached down to touch Benito's graying muzzle. "You were my first lesson in standing firm for what matters," he whispered. Even when tradition disagreed, Benito sighed in his sleep, still the teacher, still the reminder that sometimes the most profound theology comes with pause. The apostolic palace hummed with the weight of centuries. Marble floors that had borne the footsteps of saints and sinners alike now carried the measured tread of diplomats and cardinals. In the papal office, beneath frescoed ceilings where angels gazed down with eternal patience, Pope Leo XIV sat at his massive desk, his expression properly solemn as the Spanish ambassador elaborated on his government's new initiative for refugee assistance. "Your Holiness, we believe this approach aligns perfectly with your encyclical on human dignity," the ambassador said, his hands moving in elegant emphasis. Leo nodded, offering the appropriate smile. "The Church appreciates Spain's commitment to the vulnerable." His response was measured, thoughtful, exactly what was expected from the Vicar of Christ. But beneath his composed exterior, his attention kept slipping toward the nearly invisible door in the wood-paneled wall. Behind it lay his private study where, on a cushion specially placed for him, Benito had been sleeping when Leo left him an hour ago. The medication Dr. Moretti had prescribed made the dog drowsy, but also eased his pain. A fair trade, perhaps. But Leo couldn't help wondering if Benito had awakened, confused by his absence. Cardinal Russo, the Vatican Secretary of State, cleared his throat subtly, drawing Leo's focus back to the meeting. The cardinal's knowing glance suggested he had noticed the Pope's momentary distraction. Perhaps His Holiness would like to address the funding question. Cardinal Russo prompted gently. Leo seamlessly rejoined the conversation, years of diplomatic training carrying him forward. The Vatican Bank is prepared to offer matching funds for the initiative, provided the accountability measures we discussed are implemented. The meeting continued, weaving through politics, theology, and finance. Leo maintained his presence, asked insightful questions, offered wisdom when needed. But inside, a private clock ticked away precious moments. Moments he could be spending with Benito, whose remaining time could now be counted in sunrises rather than seasons. When a soft whimper emerged from behind the study door, so faint that only Leo noticed it, his heart stuttered. No one else reacted, the sound apparently below the threshold of their attention. But for Leo, it might as well have been a thunderclap. "Your Holiness." The German ambassador looked concerned. "You were saying about the ethics committee?" Leo composed his features, fighting the urge to end the meeting immediately. "Yes, forgive me. The committee will need representatives from diverse backgrounds." Sister Constanza entered silently with fresh water for the table. As she poured, she caught Leo's eye and gave an almost imperceptible nod toward the study door. "I'll check on him," the nod promised. Leo's shoulders relaxed slightly as she finished her task and slipped toward the private study. 2 hours later, when the diplomats finally departed with blessings and handshakes, Leo allowed himself 3 quick strides to the hidden door. He found Benito awake but comfortable, Sister Constanza sitting quietly beside him, her rosary beads moving between her fingers. He only needed reassurance, Holy Father, she said softly. Leo knelt beside his dog, formal robes pooling around him. On the floor, "So did I," he whispered, stroking Benito's head. "So did I." Few outsiders understood that the Vatican was not merely a religious institution, but a small city unto itself, with corridors and chambers that tourists never glimpsed. In these hidden arteries of the Holy See, far from the magnificence of St. Peter's or the grandeur of the Sistine Chapel, the true heart of daily Vatican life pulsed steadily. And it was here, in these shadowed passages, that Benito had found his extended family. Sister Constanza moved swiftly through the service corridor, connecting the papal apartments to the kitchen. In her hands, she carried a small bowl of the special broth Chef Paolo had prepared. Organic chicken, vegetables, and herbs simmered slowly and strained twice to be gentle on Benito's failing kidneys. "How is our patient today?" Chef Paolo asked when she returned, his burly hands pausing in their work of kneading dough for the evening's bread. "Weaker," she answered simply. "His Holiness is with him now, but he has the general audience in an hour." The chef nodded, understanding the unspoken request. "I'll have Antonio bring up fresh broth every 2 hours, and the rice balls he likes. They're easy on his stomach." In the papal gardens, Marco Varelli carefully selected the softest grass clippings, creating a fragrant nest in a shallow basket. For years, he had quietly maintained a sunny spot where Benito could rest during his walks with the Pope, keeping it private from tourist paths and official routes. Today, he added a few sprigs of lavender, a scent that had always made the old dog's nose twitch with pleasure. "Is it time?" he asked softly, when Sister Constanza passed on her way back to the papal apartments. She didn't pretend to misunderstand. "Soon. Dr. Moretti has been called twice since yesterday." The news travelled quietly among them. Paolo in the kitchen, Marco in the gardens, Swiss Guard Captain Lucerne, who had adjusted security patrols to ensure privacy for the Pope's walks, with Benito, housekeeping supervisor Greta, who had smuggled in special cleaning products for the inevitable accidents as Benito's control weakened. Each carried the knowledge with the solemnity of a sacred trust. They had been keeping Benito's existence quiet for years, not because they feared repercussions. No rule explicitly forbade the Pope from having a pet, but because they understood that some relationships flourish best in privacy. The bond between the Holy Father and his dog belonged to the man, not to the office. That evening, they gathered in the small staff kitchen after duties were complete. No one had called a meeting, yet somehow they all appeared, drawn by the shared current of concern. "I've adjusted the night rotation," Captain Lucerne said quietly. "Stefan will be on duty outside the papal apartments. He knows to alert Dr. Moretti if needed." Greta placed a small medallion of St. Francis on the table. "For his collar," she explained. When the time comes." They looked at one another, this unlikely collection of Vatican servants united by their care for an aging dog and the man who loved him. No official acknowledgement would ever recognize their efforts. No papal commendation would honor their conspiracy of compassion. But in their quiet devotion to Benito and his master, they embodied something profound, the understanding that sometimes the most sacred duties are the ones that appear nowhere in any official text. Midnight in the Pope's private chapel cast long shadows across ancient stones. Candlelight wavered against icons of saints who had wrestled with their own dark nights of the soul centuries before. The space was designed for solitary communion with God, intimate enough that whispers echoed, and silences had weight. Tonight, those silences felt heavier than usual. Leo knelt at the prie-dieu, his formal papal attire replaced by a simple cassock. At his feet lay Benito on a cushion brought by Sister Constanza, his breathing shallow but steady. The dog had worsened throughout the day, refusing even Chef Paolo's broth by evening. Now, in the deepest hours of night, he rested in the only comfort that seemed to help, his master's presence. You should rest, Holy Father. Cardinal Emanuele Bianchi's voice came, gently from the shadowed doorway. The elderly theologian had been Leo's mentor before his elevation to the papacy, and remained one of the few who could speak to him as Miguel rather than as Pope. Leo didn't turn. I will rest when he rests, old friend. The cardinal approached, slowly, his own joints protesting the late hour. He knelt with difficulty beside the Pope, making the sign of the cross before settling his gaze on Benito. I have been debating theology with myself tonight, Leo said after a long silence. The kind that isn't found in encyclicals. The best kind, Cardinal Bianchi responded with a small smile. What troubles you? Leo's hand rested on Benito's side, feeling each labored breath. We speak confidently of human souls, their eternal nature, their divine spark. Yet we remain curiously uncertain about the souls of those who share our journey without sharing. Our species. The cardinal nodded, his eyes wise with understanding. You're wondering if you'll see him again. Is it blasphemous, Leo whispered, for the vicar of Christ to hope that heaven has room for a dog? If love is the essence of divinity, then how could God reject that which has loved so purely? Cardinal Bianchi reached down to stroke Benito's ear. Perhaps our theology is too narrow, not God's heart. Leo's eyes glistened in the candlelight. I have comforted thousands in grief, offered the Church's wisdom on death and resurrection. Yet here I am, undone by the impending loss of a creature many would consider insignificant. Not insignificant to you, the cardinal corrected gently, and therefore not insignificant to God. Benito stirred slightly, a soft whimper escaping before he settled. Leo leaned closer, whispering something in Spanish, a prayer, perhaps, or simply words of comfort, too intimate for translation. Do you know what brought me to faith originally? Leo asked suddenly, still looking at his dog. Not grand cathedrals or complex theology. It was watching my grandmother feed stray cats behind our apartment. God notices, she told me. Every small kindness is written in heaven. Cardinal Bianchi remained silent, recognizing the rare gift of witnessing the Pope not as leader of a global faith, but as a man confronting the most universal of human experiences, loving something he must lose. I believe, Leo said finally, his voice finding strength, that love cannot simply vanish. Whatever form it takes beyond this life, it must continue. He looked up at the crucifix hanging before them. Otherwise, what would be the point of any of this? Benito sighed deeply as if in agreement, his tired eyes reflecting the candlelight as he gazed up at the two men keeping vigil in the sacred darkness. Autumn had painted the Vatican gardens in amber and crimson, a tapestry of falling, leaves drifting across centuries-old pathways. The afternoon sun hung low, casting long shadows through the cypress trees and illuminating dust motes that danced like prayers in the golden light. It was, in every sense, a perfect day for a last goodbye. Pope Leo XIV walked slowly, matching his pace to Benito's faltering steps. The dog moved as if through water, each movement deliberate and costly. Dr. Moretti had advised against the exertion, but Leo had been insistent. We have walked these gardens every day for 15 years, he had told her. I will not deny him this final journey. Now, as they followed their familiar route, past the ancient fountain where Benito had once chased a startled duck, around the marble bench where they had sat through countless sunrises, Leo carried a canvas sling fashioned by Sister Constanza. When Benito needed rest, Leo would gently lift him, cradling him against his chest before setting him down to walk again as strength returned. Remember this spot? Leo murmured as they passed an oak tree with sprawling roots. You buried your favorite ball here. We never did find it. Benito's ears twitched in recognition, his rheumy eyes briefly brightening as he sniffed the familiar ground. His tail offered a single weak wag, a ghost of his former enthusiasm. At the far edge of the garden path, where it curved toward the grotto of Our Lady, a small tour group had paused. Their guide was explaining something about the mosaic tiles, but their attention had shifted to the unusual sight before them, the Supreme Pontiff walking alone with a frail dog, stopping occasionally to lift the animal with tender care. "Is that—" A woman's voice carried on the breeze. "The Holy Father," her companion confirmed, "but who knew he had a dog?" Leo was aware of the observers but paid them no mind. Today wasn't about appearances or protocol. Today was about honoring. A bond that had sustained him through the loneliest moments of his august office. When they reached the olive tree, their special place where Benito had first approached him as a stray in the Vatican gardens years ago, Leo carefully lowered himself to the ground. The papal white cassock spread around him on the grass, collecting autumn leaves like offerings. Benito settled against him, head resting on Leo's knee, eyes closing in contentment. From this vantage point, St. Peter's Dome loomed magnificent against the deepening blue sky. The sound of distant traffic mingled with birdsong. The world continued, its rhythm while in this small corner of the garden, time seemed to pause. "Gracias, mi fiel amigo," Leo whispered, reverting to his native Spanish as he often did in their private moments. "For everything you taught me about loyalty without condition and love without judgment." Benito's eyes opened briefly, meeting Leo's gaze with a clarity that belied his failing body. In that moment, witnessed only by falling leaves and distant strangers, passed an understanding deeper than words, the recognition that even the most sacred journeys eventually reach their end, and that what matters most is not the destination, but the company kept along the way. The shadows lengthened across the gardens as man and dog sat together, storing away one final memory against the coming darkness. The Vatican press office hummed with the electric tension of breaking news. Phones rang incessantly. Keyboards clattered. Monsignor Paolo Rossi, the Vatican's press secretary, stared at his computer screen in dismay as the image loaded, a clearly amateur photograph, slightly blurred but unmistakable. Pope Leo XIV sitting beneath an olive tree in the gardens, cradling a frail dog in his white-robed arms. The image had appeared first on a tourist's social media account with the caption, "Most beautiful thing I've ever seen." The Pope and his dog saying goodbye, Yewish Pope Leo, Leo's faithful companion. Within hours, it had been shared millions of times. "The Holy Father has made no statement about a pet," Monsignor Rossi repeated for the dozenth time into his phone, his practiced diplomatic tone fraying at the edges. The Vatican does not comment on the Pope's private life, but the story had already transcended containment. Major news outlets across the globe had picked up the hashtag. Speculation ran rampant. Religious commentators debated the theological implications. Animal rights groups praised the Pope's compassion. Critics questioned whether papal attention should be focused on more pressing global matters. In his private apartments, Leo sat beside Benito's cushion, gently stroking the sleeping dog, while Cardinal Bianchi read aloud from the news reports now flooding in. The Washington Post has a headline, "Pope's dying dog reveals human side of papacy." The BBC is running a special on pets in religious leaders' lives. And there's a petition with over 100,000 signatures asking you to... The Cardinal paused, clearing his throat. "To canonize your dog." Leo closed his eyes briefly. 15 years of theological writings, 3 encyclicals on human dignity, countless addresses on peace and justice, and this is what captures the world's heart. "People recognize authentic love when they see it," Cardinal Bianchi replied gently. "Sometimes it speaks louder than doctrine." Sister Constanza entered, her usually composed features troubled. "Your Holiness," The switchboard is overwhelmed. People are calling to share stories of their own pets, asking for your prayers for sick animals, and there are journalists at every entrance. Outside in St. Peter's Square, a spontaneous gathering had formed. People brought photographs of their pets, some living, some long departed. Candles flickered in the early evening light. A news helicopter circled overhead, its distant thrum penetrating even the thick Vatican walls. Leo listened to these reports with a complex mixture of emotions. Part of him resented the intrusion into what should have remained private between him and Benito. Yet another part recognized something profound in the public response, a hunger for evidence that even the most elevated office in the church contained space for simple, uncomplicated love. "What would you have me do?" he asked, looking between his two closest advisors. Cardinal Bianchi glanced at Sister Constanza before answering. "Perhaps the question, Holy Father, is what Benito would have you do." Leo looked down at his faithful companion, whose breathing had grown more labored in the past hour. The dog's eyes remained closed, but his ear twitched at the sound of his name. "He never sought attention," Leo said softly. But neither did he hide his affection. Outside, the crowd in the square began singing, a spontaneous hymn rising like incense into the darkening sky. The world was watching, waiting, projecting their own stories of loss and love onto a relationship they glimpsed only through a stranger's photograph. And in that moment, what had been most private became unavoidably public. Midnight transformed the Pope's bedroom into a landscape of shadows and whispered concerns. The space that had been designed for solitary reflection now felt crowded with the apparatus of medicine. An IV stand where Dr. Moretti had placed fluids to combat Benito's dehydration, monitoring equipment that beeped softly, oxygen tanks that hissed a steady rhythm. The clinical intrusion seemed at odds with the room's usual austere dignity, yet served as a stark reminder of the battle being waged against time itself. Benito lay on his cushion, which had been moved to Leo's own bed. The dog's breathing had become labored, each inhale a visible effort that lifted his entire ribcage. His eyes, when they opened, held the glazed look of one already beginning the journey elsewhere. The medications are no longer managing his pain. Effectively, Dr. Moretti explained quietly, her professional demeanor softened by genuine compassion. His kidneys have almost completely shut down. Leo sat on the edge of the bed, his hand never leaving Benito's side. "He is suffering," he stated rather than asked, his voice hollow. "Yes, Your Holiness." Dr. Moretti's answer was gentle but unflinching. Significantly, Sister Constanza stood nearby, her rosary beads moving silently through her fingers. The soft lamplight caught the wetness on her cheeks, though she made no sound. "There is another option," Dr. Moretti continued after a long pause. "I can administer medication that would allow him to fall asleep and not wake again. It would be peaceful, without pain." The words hung in the air like incense, heavy with implication. For countless others, Leo had offered wisdom about suffering, about God's mercy, about the sanctity of life and the dignity of death. Now those abstract theological concepts crystallized into a single agonizing choice. "You're speaking of euthanasia," Leo said, the word itself seeming to darken the room. "I'm speaking of preventing unnecessary suffering," Dr. Moretti corrected gently. "Many would consider it a final act of mercy." Leo closed his eyes, his fingers finding the familiar spot behind Benito's ear that had always brought comfort to them both. The dog responded with the slightest pressure against his hand, a ghost of their old communication. "Leave us," Leo said finally, "just for a moment." When the room had emptied, Leo leaned close to Benito's ear. "What would be mercy, old friend? To hold on to you until the very end, or to let you go before the worst of the pain?" Benito's eyes opened briefly, finding Leo's with startling clarity amidst the fog of his failing body. Something passed between them, not an answer perhaps, but a recognition, a trust built over 15 years of complete fidelity. When Dr. Moretti and Sister Costanza returned, Leo's face had changed. The internal conflict remained etched in the lines around his eyes, but beneath it lay a certainty born of love rather than doctrine. "When I was a young priest," he said without looking up, "a grandmother in my parish told me something I never forgot. She said, 'Sometimes the most sacred act is knowing when to open your hands and release what you love most.'" He looked up at Dr. Moretti, his eyes both breaking and resolute. "Help him find peace. I will stay with him until the end." Sister Costanza made the sign of the cross, tears flowing freely now. Outside the window, the eternal city glittered with distant lights, oblivious to the small death about to occur in its spiritual heart, a passing that would never appear in official Vatican records, yet would alter its leader in ways only God could fully measure. Dawn arrived with hesitant fingers of light, reaching through the leaded windows of the Pope's private study. This light was different from Rome's usual golden mornings, paler, more tentative, as if the sun itself approached with reverence. Outside, the city was still wrapped in pre-dawn quiet, the usual cacophony of traffic and voices not yet risen to disturb this sacred hour. Leo had requested his study for these final moments rather than the clinical setting of his bedroom. Here, surrounded by books that had shaped his faith and thinking, beneath the simple wooden crucifix that had followed him from Argentina to Rome, he cradled Benito in his lap. The dog lay wrapped in the soft blanket from Sister Costanza's hands, his breathing shallow but peaceful now, the pain medications having granted him a final reprieve from suffering. Dr. Moretti stood quietly near the door, medical bag at her feet. Cardinal Bianchi occupied a chair in the corner, eyes closed in prayer. Sister Costanza moved silently around the room, lighting candles that pushed back the shadows without dispelling them entirely. Marco the gardener had brought fresh olive branches, their silver-green leaves arranged in a simple vase nearby, a reminder of their special spot in the gardens. "The medication I've given him will make him very drowsy," Dr. Moretti explained softly. "When you're ready, the final injection will simply deepen that sleep until his heart stops. He won't feel any pain." Leo nodded, unable to speak. His fingers traced the familiar contours of Benito's face, the graying muzzle, the soft spot between his eyes, the ears that had always perked up at the sound of his voice. How strange that something could be simultaneously so ordinary and so devastating. The warmth of fur against his fingers, known by countless humans throughout time, yet in this moment, the most precious texture in creation. Before, Leo's voice faltered. He cleared his throat and tried again. "Before we proceed, I would like to offer a blessing." The small gathering moved closer as Leo placed his hand on Benito's head. When he spoke, it was not with the formal cadence of papal blessing, but with the intimate voice of a man saying goodbye to his dearest friend. "Benito, faithful companion, may God who created you and blessed me with your presence now welcome you home. For every moment of joy you brought, for every comfort in sorrow, for your unconditional love that asked nothing in return, thank you." His voice broke on those final words. Cardinal Bianchi moved forward, his hand resting on Leo's shoulder in silent support. "I'm ready," Leo said, looking at Dr. Moretti. She approached with quiet efficiency, administering the injection with a gentleness that spoke of her understanding of this moment's gravity. Benito barely stirred, his eyes finding Leo's face. "One last time, va con Dios, mi amigo fiel," Leo whispered, reverting to Spanish in these most intimate moments. The room fell utterly silent. Even the eternal city seemed to pause in its awakening. The only movement was Leo's hand, continuing its steady stroking of Benito's fur as the dog's breathing slowed, then stilled entirely. Sister Constanza wept silently. Marco crossed himself. Dr. Moretti stepped back, giving space to the moment. Cardinal Bianchi began to whisper the prayers for the dead, his ancient words floating like incense in the dawn light. But Leo simply continued to hold Benito, his eyes dry now, filled instead with a profound stillness. The chasm of grief that had threatened to engulf him transformed, not diminishing but changing shape, becoming a space where memory and love could dwell together in the quiet certainty that what they had shared would never truly end. Outside, the bells of St. Peter's began to toll for morning prayers, their bronze voices carrying across the awakening city, unaware that in a quiet study, a pontiff was being taught his greatest lesson on love's enduring power, not by theology or tradition, but by the small, still form cradled in his arms. St. Peter's Square overflowed with the faithful that Sunday morning, the crowd stretching far beyond its usual boundaries. The Vatican had announced nothing special about this Mass, yet something extraordinary hung in the air, an anticipation that transcended the usual reverence. Among the thousands gathered, many clutched photographs of pets, some framed in silver, others laminated or simply printed on paper and held carefully against the breeze. The image that had leaked days before had sparked a movement no one could have predicted. Monsignor Rossi watched nervously from the sidelines as Pope Leo XIV approached the altar. The press secretary had prepared a statement about the Pope's privacy, had crafted careful responses to questions about Benito, but Leo had reviewed none of it. After 3 days of seclusion following Benito's passing, the Pope had emerged with a quiet certainty that concerned his closest advisers. "The prepared homily is excellent, Your Holiness," Cardinal Bianchi had reminded him just moments before. "A reflection on the gospel of the day. There is no need to address personal matters." Leo had simply nodded, his eyes carrying the peaceful clarity that comes only after profound grief has been fully embraced. Now, as he stood before the sea of faces, Leo felt something shift within him. The formal distance between pontiff and faithful seemed to dissolve as he recognized what many were holding, images of the companions who had taught them about unconditional love, just as Benito had taught him. The scheduled readings concluded. The moment for the homily arrived. Leo looked down at the prepared text before him, then set it gently aside. 3 days ago, he began, his voice carrying clearly across the hushed square. I said goodbye to my oldest and most faithful friend. A collective intake of breath rippled through the crowd. Cardinal Bianchi closed his eyes briefly. Sister Constanza, standing at her post near the altar, felt tears threatening again. His name was Benito. He came to me as a stray puppy in Argentina. Long before I could have imagined standing before you as Pope. For 15 years, he walked beside me, through parishes and promotions, through midnight doubts and morning prayers. Leo paused, surveying the thousands of faces turned toward him. In their expressions, he saw not judgment but recognition, the universal understanding of what it means to love and to lose. Many have asked why I kept him secret. Perhaps I feared that loving a simple dog seemed too ordinary for this extraordinary office. Yet in these days of grief, I have come to understand that it is precisely in such ordinary love that we glimpse something of the divine. Throughout the square, people leaned forward, many wiping tears. A young girl held up a photograph of a golden retriever. An elderly man clutched a faded picture of a black cat to his chest. The Gospels tell us God knows when each sparrow falls. If the Creator of galaxies attends to sparrows, can we doubt that He welcomes every creature that has taught us how to love? Leo's voice strengthened. Benito never read theology. He never debated doctrine. Yet every day of his life he demonstrated what it means to love faithfully, to forgive instantly, to find joy in simple presence. The sun broke through clouds that had threatened rain all morning, illuminating the square with sudden brilliance. Some would later call it coincidence, others something more. In my years as your shepherd, I have offered many teachings. Today, I offer instead what Benito taught me, that love, in its purest form, asks nothing, declares nothing, demands nothing. It simply stays, through darkness and light, steadfast until the end. Throughout the square, cardinals exchanged glances. Vatican officials shifted uncomfortably, but the faces of the faithful reflected something transcendent, the recognition that their spiritual leader had walked through the same valley of ordinary heartbreak they knew so well. And in that moment of shared vulnerability, the distance between pontiff and people vanished, replaced by the most profound communion of all, the universal experience of loving deeply enough to feel the holy ache of loss. Spring arrived in the Vatican gardens with quiet insistence, coaxing reluctant buds from ancient branches and painting forgotten corners with wildflowers. The morning light had a particular quality unique to Roman springs, golden, gentle, carrying the promise of warmth without yet delivering its full strength. Beneath the olive tree where Pope Leo and Benito had spent countless mornings, something new had appeared. A simple wooden bench, its surface polished to a soft gleam, positioned to catch the first light of dawn. Leo sat alone on this bench, his white cassock bright against the weathered wood. 3 months had passed since Benito's farewell. The world had moved on to newer headlines, fresh controversies, different concerns. But here in the gardens, memory lingered like perfume. "The roses are early this year, Your Holiness." Marco Varelli approached with pruning shears in hand, his weathered face respectful but no longer guarded. Since the Sunday sermon, something had shifted in how the Vatican staff related to their Pope, a newfound ease, as if his shared grief had made him more accessible. "Benito always noticed the roses first," Leo replied, a small smile softening his features. He would stop and sniff each one, as if conducting an inspection. The gardener nodded, understanding flowing between them. "I've planted something special there," he said, gesturing toward a circular bed surrounding a small plaque at the base of the olive tree. "Forget-me-nots, blue, like the collar he wore." Leo's eyes followed the gesture, taking in the delicate blue flowers emerging in a perfect circle. The small bronze plaque caught the sunlight. Here rested faithful friends. Love is the only thing that never fails. The quotation from Corinthians had been Cardinal Bianchi's suggestion, but the location had been Leo's choice. "Perfect," he said simply. As Marco returned to his work, Leo noticed movement at the garden's edge. A small group of visitors, perhaps 15 people, stood hesitantly at the pathway entrance. Their presence was unusual. This section of the gardens remained closed to regular tours. Sister Constanza appeared at Leo's side, as if materializing from the morning air itself. "They've come for the bench, Holy Father," she explained softly. "Word has spread. They bring memories of their own." Leo watched as the visitors, granted rare access by Vatican security, approached slowly, reverently. An elderly woman carried a child's drawing of a spotted dog. A middle-aged man held a small urn. A young couple clutched each other's hands, fresh grief evident in their reddened eyes. "Let them come," Leo said, rising from the bench. One by one, they approached, placing their small tributes near the forget-me-nots, photographs, collar tags, handwritten notes. No words were exchanged, yet each person looked to the Pope with the same expression, recognition of shared understanding that transcended language, status, even faith itself. When the last visitor had departed, Leo remained standing before a growing collection of memories. Sister Constanza waited silently nearby, respecting his contemplation. "I worried it was unseemly," Leo said finally, "to grieve so deeply for an animal when human suffering fills our world. Yet your grief has allowed others to honor theirs," she replied. "Sometimes the most profound teaching comes not from strength, but from willingness to share our wounds." Leo nodded, his gaze following a butterfly that had settled briefly on the bench before continuing its journey across the gardens. Life continued its relentless forward movement. The church awaited his attention. Global crises demanded response. Yet something essential had been recovered in the midst of loss, a reminder that beneath titles and responsibilities, the capacity for simple love remained the truest measure of humanity. As Leo turned to leave, he paused, looking back at the bench illuminated in morning light. For a moment, just a heartbeat, he could almost see the shadow of a faithful companion waiting there, tail gently wagging, ready for whatever path they would walk next. "Until we meet again, old friend," he whispered, then turned toward the Vatican, steps lighter than they had been in months, carrying forward not just the weight of his office, but also the unexpected gift that comes when grief, fully embraced, transforms at last to gratitude.